Hi everyone, it's great to see you all. Thank you very much for being here for this final instalment of our series Forms, Fragments and Fractures in Contemporary Women's Life Writing. We're really delighted to be welcoming another three fantastic speakers for this session on 21st century autofictions. All three doing really brilliant work in the field, and we're very excited to get a glimpse into ongoing and new work today. So I'll start by briefly introducing the session and then hand over to Raquel to introduce our three speakers, and we'll keep up the same format as in previous sessions of keeping our questions until the end. We're really looking forward to the discussion. Autofiction as a mode of life writing has been contested since its theoretical inception, a point of origin that is fittingly also blurred. While the coining of autofiction is attributed most frequently to Serge Dubrovsky and his 1977 work Fils, so as a response to the Case aveugle or the blank box in Philippe Lejeune's Le Pacte autobiographique, Myra Bloom observes that the term had in fact already appeared in Anglophone criticism 5 years prior, when it was used by Paul West in his review of Richard Ellman's Freddie and Shell and the Kids in the New York Times. As Bloom writes, despite the fact that West subsequently wrote his own self-described autofiction, Gala, in 1977, so the same year as Fils, it was Dubrovsky who went on to become the so-called patriarch of autofiction, primarily thanks to his repeated return to and redefinition of the term in the course of his oeuvre. These repetitions, returns, and redefinitions are at the heart of our evolving theorization of autofiction as a practice, as the term and concept have spread from France across the world. There's still nothing resembling a consensus as to what does or does not come under the umbrella of autofiction. The formalist definition that relies on the pairing of the autobiographical pact and the label roman or novel, which continues to predominate in Francophone discussions, has faded progressively from view as the label has been taken up across different contexts. It's precisely the malleability of autofiction, of course, that has enabled the global spread that has come to characterize 21st century's Anglophone study of trajectories of critical thinking of autofiction in Anglophone criticism. Alexandra Effer and I established a rapid spread from 2000 to 2020 in the languages, nations, and cultural contexts of primary texts that are considered under the label. So in this study, the number of languages of primary works increased from 3 in the period between 2000 and 2002 to 16 between 2018 and 2020. And our data testified to a similar widening of the concept to include forms other than the long prose text and also to encompass different media. This rapid and still expanding increase in applications of autofiction push at the bounds of our understanding of the practice and invite us not so much to delimit what autofiction is as to explore what it does. In the 21st century literary marketplace, there is a growing and decidedly reductive tendency to narrow its many functions to one, to that of label. Autofiction is a best-selling phenomenon across the three contexts to which we will turn today, and many more besides. And the ever-growing appetite for autofictional works has, perhaps unsurprisingly, fueled long-standing criticisms of autofiction, criticisms that are more vehement and varied than those directed at any other practice under the umbrella of life writing. In addition to recurrent dismissals of literary value, the most prevalent of these criticisms are ethical, so ranging from narcissism, exhibitionism, and apoliticism to exploitation, immorality, and duplicity. But perhaps the more potent at the moment are existential, those that claim to dissolve the particularities of autofictional practice either into fiction or autobiography. And indeed, in the latter case, scholars who uphold the importance of autofiction as term and concept have themselves recently come under fire, so accused in Sydney Smith and Julia Watson's 2024 revised edition of Reading Autobiography, so Reading Autobiography Now, of, and I quote, ignoring the complexity of life narrative and the productive theorizing of autobiography studies. The papers in today's session will refute this claim by showcasing the significance of autofiction in 21st century women's writing across Spain, Italy, and Portugal. In the light of the limiting models of identity and modes of writing imposed on women that have emerged in multiple papers in this series so far, the elision of the bio, that is, of externally verifiable anchors in self-representation, takes on new importance. The case studies that our speakers will explore today will shine a light on the importance and affordances of autofiction as a mode in personal navigations of national and global crises, from the 2008 economic crash through entrenched gender-based violence and to the painful legacies of colonialism and fascism. Over to you, Raquel, to introduce our speakers.
Thank you, Hani. Thank you for this informative presentation on autofiction. I couldn't I couldn't wait for it because you are the expert here. So without further ado, I'm presenting our first speaker, Maite Usoz de la Fuente. Maite is a lecturer in Spanish at University of Leicester. She specializes in cultural production in post-Franco Spain, with particular interest in visual culture, space, and human geography, and the work, of course, of contemporary women writers. She is the author of Urban Space, Identity and Postmodernity in 1980s Spain, and co-editor of the Modern Spanish Canon Visibility, Cultural Capital, and the Academy. She is currently preparing a second monograph for publication, provisionally titled Spanish Spaces of Crisis, and under contract with Liverpool University Press. We're looking forward to reading it. To reading it. I pass it over to you, Maite. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks, Raquel. And in fact, some of what I will be discussing today is partly the research of that sort of new project. Well, first of all, thanks to Hani and Raquel for organizing this seminar series and for inviting me to take part. Also, thank you, Hani, for that very interesting introduction on autofiction and the slipperiness, I guess, and contested nature of the term, which is something that I do not explicitly discuss in my paper, but I feel it's implicitly there, hopefully. And I will, in a minute, share some slides, but just wanted to say that it's kind of customary to say that things are a work in progress. I think in this case, it's very true, especially of the second part, because obviously there's a part that I have developed in relation to sort of my work on a monograph, but the second part is very tentative and in some ways maybe exceeds some of the themes that we're exploring as part of the series, but hopefully nonetheless will be relevant and of interest. I'll try to argue the case for it. So without further ado, hopefully you can see the slides. Today, I'd like to present to you a reading of two works by contemporary Spanish author Cristina Fallarás. And both works could be seen as examples of either life writing or autofiction, but the approach deployed in each text, as well as the thematic focus, shifts very significantly. And I'm primarily interested in that shift, not just for what it might tell us about contemporary women's life writing or autofiction in Spain, or about Cristina Fallarás as an author, but also because I believe it potentially has wider implications. And that's where I'm a little bit uncertain and tentative. So welcome your thoughts, your feedback, and your questions. So start by introducing Cristina Fallarás, for those of you who might not be familiar with her, and the first text on which I will focus, which is her A la puta calle, Crónica de un desahucio, published in 2013. So Fallarás is a Spanish journalist and author born in Zaragoza in 1968. And up until the publication of A la puta calle in 2013, she was mostly known as the author of noir and crime fiction. And in the slide, I've tried to sort of group her works. So below her image is a volume of poetry that she has published. She's quite polyphacetic. Then she has, at the top is different forms of live writing and autofiction that she has engaged in. And below is her output as a sort of crime novelist. So varies. And on the side, actually, there are some titles that are historical fiction. So just to give you an overview, a visual overview of her output. As I was saying, before the publication of A la puta calle, she was mainly known as a crime novelist. So this is a bit of a turning point in her trajectory, arguably. And her fictional Últimos días en el puesto del Este from 2011, in a sense, might be read as a companion text to A la puta calle, in as much as it presents a similar struggle for survival, but the treatment is very different. So A la puta calle is autobiographical or autofictional. I guess we can argue about this later, whereas Últimos días en el puesto del Este is very much a fictional text. So, moving to the first text, A la puta calle, crónica de un desahucio, this text tells the story of the author's own experience of economic destitution in the wake of the global 2008 recession, which culminates in the loss of her home, repossessed by the bank as she is unable to meet mortgage payments. Fallarás' text is structured chronologically, with an opening section that states the aims and scope of her enunciation, followed by 4 chapters, each covering a 1-year period, from 2009 to 2012, and tracing the narrator's progressive transformation from middle-class liberal professional to unemployed, evicted activist and squatter, which, as I was saying, reflects Fallarás' own experiences, and she was also very open and very candid about these experiences and engaged in several interviews about her eviction process at the time when it was taking place. In the opening of pages of the text, Fallarás writes that she's embarking in, and I quote, I'm going to read it in Spanish, but the translation is there for if you need it. She's embarking in la narración de mi desahucio, un proceso de hundimiento en la miseria que arranca el día que me despidieron de un diario a finales de 2008 y termina aquella tarde del 13 de noviembre de 2012 en la que el tipo llamó a la puerta y me convirtió en desahuciada. So, while this is an avowedly autobiographical account, some of its features, such as the fact that it selectively mobilizes different aspects of the experience whilst omitting others, as well as the inclusion of 2 surrealist interludes with the title De cuando nos comíamos las patas de las sillas en Ucronía, or of the time in which we ate the chair legs uchronically, have invited readings of the text as fiction, or autofiction in some cases, but also as examples of gonzo journalism. So again, the question of generic ascription is quite slippery for the text. Iris de Benito notes that Fallarás' text is the result of a deliberate hybridization of fiction and non-fiction genres, and that it doesn't really neatly fit into either category. It is not a straightforwardly fictional narrative, because much of the account overlaps with the author's lived experiences, and those lived experiences are actually fairly well documented, as I was saying. But it is neither a conventionally autofictional text in the sense that self-fictionalization strategies do not serve the purpose of problematizing the boundary between fiction and non-fiction, or between authorial and biographical I. If anything, it seems that Fallarás mobilizes some of those strategies to maybe create some distance and sort of avoid certain pathos in the narration. And so, while the text is on one level a subjective first-person account of an individual experience of poverty, social exclusion, and home eviction, it is also more than this in that Fallarás frames that experience within a broader context of economic, social, and political crisis, by, for example, including unemployment figures, and also by making multiple references to contemporaneous social and political developments in Spain, general strikes, or, for example, the Indignados movement. Fallarás herself has argued that this is an autobiographical account and a literary text, and she's invested in vindicating that both things are not mutually exclusive. sort of going against the prejudice that autobiographical or autofictional narrative is less literary. So she writes, or she said in an interview actually that, and I quote, "A veces la gente piensa que porque es no ficción no puede ser literatura, y yo quise hacer literatura. En A la puta calle no hay nada que no sea estrictamente cierto y no haya sucedido estrictamente como lo cuento. Lo que sí hay es una manera de narrarlo que aspira a lo literario." So I guess here vindicating the literary quality and value of the text, notwithstanding the fact that it's, in her own words, non-fiction. So one of the singularities of Fallarás' chronicles is how her eviction process is portrayed as inextricably linked to her situation of unemployment, a strategy that she uses to counter the narrative according to which those who lost their homes during the 2008 crisis in Spain had simply overstretched themselves financially, or were living, quote unquote, beyond their means, and were thus at least partly to blame for the predicament in which they found themselves. The author's sacking is depicted as a traumatic event that provokes a series of feelings typical of a grieving process: shock, disbelief, denial, anger, sadness, and guilt. What the narrator is mourning in the immediate aftermath of losing her job is not so much the job itself or the income it secured, but her sense of herself as a successful and respected journalist and author. In order to counter this identity crisis, she feels the need to, and I quote, "enumerar sin descanso todo lo que sabes, lo que eres, lo que quieres. Es tu lucha contra la muerte." End of quote. So, at this point in the chronicle, during the first year of this descent into poverty, the narrator retains some faith in the possibility of reversing her situation. And so during her second year of unemployment in 2010, the narrator embarks in the writing of 2 novels in the hope of winning literary prize money. And she's very blunt and very open about the fact that she's not really pursuing a creative project as much as trying to keep a roof over her head with these novels. And it's also interesting to note that this also correlates with Fallarás' output as a fiction writer, because the novels can be sort of linked to Últimos días en el puesto del Este and Las Niñas Perdidas, which were both published in 2011. In the third year of this process, chronicled in A la puta calle, which is 2011, the narrator's freefall is temporarily paused as she wins both the literary prizes she had entered for each of these texts. And this prize money buys her some time, but given the size of her debt with the bank and the debts contracted with others, so she owes money for children's school meals, she owes money to family members and so on, she very quickly finds herself in the same situation as before, unable to meet her mortgage payments. And by the final year of her descent, by 2022, the narrator is aware that her experience of destitution has radically changed her. As she notes, and I quote, "Tuve que escribir que ya no soy una mujer pacífica." It is noteworthy that in this quote, the narrator does not simply state that she's no longer a peaceful woman, but that she had to convey that transformation in writing, suggesting that it is only via this articulation that her metamorphosis from liberal middle-class professional to angry activist is finalized. Indeed, throughout the text, there is an awareness of how putting things into words can be an often painful awareness-raising mechanism. Elsewhere, Fallarás writes, and I quote, "Saber las cosas que pasan es un vaso de algodón. El hierro, el filo, está en enunciarlas." But enunciation also serves as a resistance strategy. As she puts it elsewhere, it means that you can still fight. In this context, it seems pertinent to note that scholarship on women's life writing often points to the connection between that genre and trauma. For example, Suzette Henke suggests that, and I quote, "the major impetus behind autobiographical literature in general, and women's life writing in particular, may be the articulation of a haunting and debilitating emotional crisis that, for the author, borders on the unspeakable." End of quote. Fallarás echoes this view when she affirms that, when writing A la puta calle, la narración se convirtió en una manera de sobrevivir, de reconstruirme, de rehacerme. And this is her speaking in a later interview of 2018. Critics like Henke underline the therapeutic potential of life writing in attempting to overcome, or at least make sense of, traumatic experiences. And Linda Coleman posits that the healing dimension of life writing is connected not just to meaning making, but also to its enabling, quote, the construction of an empowering and sympathetic other, a community of readers, end of quote. Both of these insights, that trauma often constitutes the main catalyst of women's life writing, and that such writing can have therapeutic and community-building properties, apply to A la puta calle, and are arguably carried a step further in the next text to which I briefly want to turn my attention today, the project Ahora contamos, nosotras. So, if economic destitution was the traumatic experience that drove the writing of the first text, gender discrimination and violence constitute the focal point for the second. But there is also a shift in approach, where A la puta calle is a first-person account of an individual experience of home eviction, even if framed as part of the collectively experienced recession. Ahora contamos nosotras chronicles the wave of testimonies, around 3 million in a 2-week period, shared with Fallarás by social media in 2018, after she called on women to share their experiences of gender discrimination and violence using the hashtag Cuéntalo, or tell your experience. And of course, this is in 2018, so we might think of Cuéntalo as perhaps a Spanish version of the hashtag #MeToo, but it responded also to a specifically Spanish event or series of events, namely the passing of a sentence in the gang rape case known as La Manada in April of 2018. So this was a case where the men convicted were initially convicted of sexual assault rather than rape on the grounds that the victim didn't actively fight, let's say, or struggle against them. And this led to a sort of social outcry and mobilizations in Spain, both in the streets and on social media. And Cuéntalo was Fallarás' take, I guess, or reaction or participation, I guess, contribution to this. In Ahora contamos nosotras, she doesn't really reproduce those testimonies that were shared with her, but she sort of tries to frame them. Iris de Benito Mesa calls it una especie de introducción crítica del compendio testimonial, a critical introduction of sorts to the actual testimonies. The testimonies themselves are archived online in the link I include there. But in the essay that was actually published as a book in analogous in paper, Fallarás explains the origins of the project in the context of that sentence, and also reflects on the subtle silencing mechanisms that have prevented these women from coming forward and voicing their experiences before. In contrast to the previous silence, which enabled perpetrators and allowed others to minimize the extent of the problem, personal testimony is hailed by Fallarás as an empowering mechanism, as it can, when shared, enable others to recognize elements of their own experiences and encourage them to come forward and share them too. As in A la puta calle, then, the power of enunciation is vindicated, but in this case, that enunciation is no longer singular but collective. And the form it takes is, obviously there is the essay, but also we have an online repository of testimonies. This shift from singular to collective is not free of risks. And this is something that Iris de Benito Mesa, who has authored the only article I know of on Ahora contamos nosotras, acknowledges. Thinking about the ethics of mediation or the problematic notion of quote unquote giving a voice. I'm not sure this is what Fallarás is trying to do, but one could perhaps argue that it is. That could be the topic for a whole different paper, and perhaps something that can be discussed in the Q&A. But for now, I'm going to slightly brush that question to one side to focus instead on what makes the shift from singular to collective possible, and conversely, what might make it unviable. And what I found very interesting is that in a 2017 interview, Cristina Fallarás explained how when she was writing the first text, A la puta calle, she had contacted several other journalists who she knew faced similar circumstances to her own, who had lost their jobs, who were financially destitute, and in some cases at risk also of home eviction. And she invited and encouraged them to also share their experiences. But these individuals, who she doesn't name, but she says there were at least 6 of declined to share those experiences out of a combination of shame and fear for the consequences. Some of them said to her that if they were to make public what they were going through, they may never work again, for example. And this contrast between the reticence to make public a situation of extreme financial need and the exposure of testimonies on experiences of gendered violence seems striking. And to me, and this is a very tentative point, so you might rebuke it later, it suggests perhaps that feminism has failed, namely in furnishing individuals with an awareness that the difficult predicaments in which they find themselves are not self-determined, but the result of systemic injustices. In other words, whereas many women can not only verbalize experiences of gender violence and discrimination, but also interpret them as instances of structural sexism in a manner that neutralizes shame and activates collective responses, those affected by economic hardship seem less able to identify the systemic causes or the structural dimensions underlying their situation. One might argue that the testimonies that came forward under the hashtag Cuéntalo were doing this under the cover of, but that's not really always the case, as Fallarás has also explained in interviews. And in fact, she said that one of the key differences between this project and a later project on which I'm not going to touch, but which I will mention here, this is something that she released more recently, is that in Cuéntalo, the experiences, and I quote, están contadas desde tu identidad. And indeed, in this project, we see many public figures, Spanish actors, politicians, journalists, contributing their experiences without hiding their identity. We also see unknown women providing testimonies, including their names under them, or other details that would make identification possible. So could be argued that in actively eschewing anonymity, these women seem invested in what more recently Giselle Pellicot has verbalized so eloquently as an effort to ensure that shame changes sides. So this increasing awareness by women that being survivors of gendered violence is not a cause for shame contrasts with the stigma and silence that still surrounds the experience of economic destitution. That poverty, unlike gender and sexual violence, remains a taboo subject points to a collective inability or unwillingness to acknowledge its structural roots. A failure which I feel is having autopolpable effects in Spain and globally. And I've illustrated this failure with the contrast and visual contrast, which I'll need to explain for those who don't know the Spanish context. But for me, it's the shift in media attention, for example, from a decade ago, the attention on the Plataforma de Afectados por la Hipoteca, which was a grassroots group trying to prevent evictions from taking place and defending the right to sort of having a roof over your head, to Desocupa, which is a platform invested in precisely the opposite, in facilitating evictions of people who might have fallen into arrears. So arguably a shift from attempts to build a fair economic order to a vindication of a very muscular, as seen in the logo for Desocupa, a very macho form of capitalism. And I guess this might seem very far from the focus of this series, which after all is on women's life writing, but I think it's nonetheless a shift that is relevant because it's relevant to contemporary women's lives, since, as we know, this brave new world order has embarked in a systematic curtailing of women's rights. So I think I'll end on that slightly depressing and pessimistic note, but I look forward to your questions afterwards. Thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Maite. Thank you for bringing in a topic that's very important. I was thinking the whole time, we can discuss it later, about the concept of agoraphobia coined by Adela Cortina, and I think it reads very well with this last slide that you presented and with Cristina Fallarás' projects. But well, we can discuss it later. For now, I'm going to present our second speaker, Katrin Wehling-Giorgi. Katrin is a professor of Italian studies as well as fellow and co-lead of the research cluster Trauma, Memory, Violence at the Institute for Medical Humanities, Durham University. Her recent research has focused on the study of Second World War and contemporary women writers from a transnational perspective, and more specifically on subversive forms of motherhood, female subjectivity, as well as the visual and spatial negotiation of trauma. She's the author of Gada and Beckett, Storytelling, Subjectivity and Fracture, and she has co-edited 6 books and special journal issues on Elsa Morante, Goliarda Sapienza, Elena Ferrante, and on trauma narratives. For example, Goliarda Sapienza in Context, Trauma Narratives in Italian and Transnational Women Writers, Elena Ferrante in a global context, comparative approaches to Elena Ferrante, Traumas, Bodies, Language, Romance, for the journal Romance Studies. 50 years of La Storia, Elsa Morante History, and La Storia di Elsa Morante e la sua attualità a 50 anni dalla pubblicazione. She's currently working on a book project entitled Spectral Histories, Women Narrating Trauma in Post-War Italy, under contract with Palgrave Macmillan, another project we are looking forward to reading. Thank you, Katrin, and over to you.
Thank you so much, Raquel, and thank you so much to the organizers. First of all, I've really enjoyed, as I said earlier, this series, and I've found it really special to have the 3 language areas of Spanish, Portuguese, and Italian brought together, because that's quite a rare occasion, and I've been really pleased to hear so many excellent papers. So as Raquel was saying, my paper is part of a wider book project that looks at trauma as a defining feature of post-war Italian and transnational women's writing, and with a specific focus on embodied visual and spatial storytelling, as well as on maternal transmissions of trauma. And as Maite was also saying earlier, I won't sort of problematize the notion of autofiction in my talk, and I'm really glad that Hani has done that in the introduction. But I will touch on many of the issues that we talked about, and I think there are some really interesting points of contact there. So my talk today will be on the Italian-Somali writer, journalist, and activist Igiaba Scego, much of whose work focuses on the lasting legacy of colonialism in Italy and on the lack of wider public engagement with the atrocities committed under the regime. And her 2 major works of autofiction, which I'll say a bit more about in a moment, which are both set in her native city of Rome and reconstruct her own story set against the collective memory of her family's past in Somalia. So she really sort of interweaves the orally transmitted stories that are bequeathed from it by her extended family and principally by her mother, who is illiterate, or she doesn't read or write. And I will argue that Scego positions herself not only as an empathic listener, building on Aleida Assmann's notion of the empathic listener, but also as an archive. And the archive heavily features in the book as well. So in a close reading of the novel's spaces and bodies and images, I will show how the author employs alternative semiotic codes, so what goes beyond the strictly verbal to capture the experience of trauma, which in the sort of first wave of trauma theory has long been considered as unspeakable. And that's something that was also briefly discussed in the previous talk. But just very briefly, to those of you who are not familiar with Scego's work, so she's one of the most prominent contemporary Italian writers, a really important voice in the long neglected public debate on the legacy of colonialism and fascism, which is particularly important, obviously, also in the current political climate. She was born in Rome, so she's not a first generation immigrant in 1974 to Somali parents who had left Somalia following Barra's coup d'etat in 1969, so the start of a dictatorship which would last until the early 90s. And Italy has a particularly long history of colonialist occupation in Somalia that effectively lasted until 1960 with the Italian trusteeship, which was allocated by the United Nations. So in her first work of autofiction, which you can see here, La mia casa è dove sono, my home is where I am, Scego narrates her own and her family's life through iconic and lesser-known landmarks and monuments of the city of Rome that bear the sort of hidden traces of Italy's colonial history. So it's very much a spatially organized novel. Whereas in her latest book, which I'll be talking about mainly today, which is from 2023, called Cassandra in Mogadishu, Scego further delves into these hidden geographies and unveils some of the effective links of her family histories with stories, objects, and material remnants of a lost collective archive of past atrocities. So, and different from the first memoir, autofiction, it's been called in many different ways. There's a major focus on collective memory and trauma, which is referred to in one of the novel's key terms, Giro, which is Somali for illness. So there's also a really interesting translingual element, which I won't have time to go into, but which sort of assumes a broader significance, which is very close to trauma in the novel. So here Scego really positions herself as the scribe of an undocumented, orally transmitted past that threatens to be obliterated. Now, interestingly, she there is a sort of final section in the book, which is entitled Autobiografia in Movimento, which is sort of put together with the acknowledgements of the novel. And here she refers to a book as an autobiografia in movimento, so an autobiography in movement. The narrative takes the form of a letter, which is addressed to Igiaba Scego's niece, Soraya, who lives in Canada as part of a globally fragmented Somali diaspora, and it chronicles the family's experiences of loss, separation, and exile across more than 3 decades of the Somali civil war. And the novel is a second-person narrative, and it has a sort of kaleidoscopic chorus of voices that foreground the relational, embodied, and narrative constitution of the nomadic subject. So the letter form is very much inspired by James Baldwin's A Letter to My Nephew from 1962, which is also cited in the epigraph of the novel, and thereby sort of positioning herself in a lineage of writing. So the letter to my nephew specifically reflects on what it means to live as a Black man in a country dominated by racism. So Scego refers to her work as an autobiography in movement that is built on, and I'm quoting here, on a sort of shifting notion of the past. So autobiography, I'll read the Italian, but you've got the translation there. L'autobiografia è affascinante per il suo costruirsi in costante movimento. Il passato non è mai fermo. Non tutti gli eventi ci sono chiari nello stesso momento, allo stesso modo. Tutto è legato e quanto siamo disposti a scavare e ad accettare ciò che il passato ci svela. E poi c'è la parola dell'altro che apre e chiude spiragli. So it's very interesting here, this focus also on the words of others, which brings in this relational aspect, which reminds me of another prominent contemporary Italian writer, Elena Ferrante, who has very much written and sort of reflected a lot on this relational aspect in her latest work, In the Margins, I margini e dettato, where she sort of writes about the discovery in the course of her writing career of relational and polyphonic storytelling with the famous friendship couple, which some of you might be familiar with, Elena and Lila of the My Brilliant Friends series. So I'm quoting here from Immagini e dettato: se negli altri testi le protagoniste scrivevano autobiografie, diari, confessioni sospinte dalle loro ferite nascoste, Ora che l'io narrante ha delle amiche, lo sforzo non è più scrivere per sé dei traffici col mondo, ma raccontare le altre, esserne raccontata in un gioco complesso di immedesimazione ed estraneità. So here she reflects specifically on this complex interplay of identification and estrangement, and how she arrived at that after having written autobiographies of sort of narrators narrating their own lives, because she is obviously writing under a pseudonym and we do not know for sure who she is. So coming back to Igiaba Scego, the author grounds her story, which is dedicated to le zie, so to the aunts, in a new matrilineal genealogy, which is framed on the one hand by her mother Hoyo, so referred to as in the Somali for mother, who emerges as a key source of storytelling, and the addressee, the main addressee, is who's of course in part the reader, but also Soraya, who is the main, her niece, who is the main addressee in the narrative. So here she writes, we can search o possiamo ricercare la nostra memoria perduta aggrappandoci ai racconti di famiglia, ai racconti di Hoyo, per esempio, di mamma Halima e di Zara. So here she writes about this female genealogy of stories, which she is building on in her work. And in terms of spaces, so the first trope I want to explore a bit more, in Cassandra Mogadishu, the author narrator sets herself the task of constructing a record of the past by interweaving these orally transmitted storied matter, as we might tell them, which has been bequeathed by her extended family. So she positions herself as an empathic and to some extent also as what Assmann calls an entangled listener, which is sort of a listener who's embedded in an entangled network of told and untold stories, and as an archive. So here the archive Scego is referring to is twofold. On the one hand, we have an oral transmission of stories documented by her mother as a storyteller and herself as a scribe. And here I'm quoting from Cassandra, la guerra ha distrutto tutto, tutto inghiottito, perso, venduto. Il nostro archivio è Hoyo, so our archive is Hoyo, e chiunque abbia visto la Somalia prima della distruzione. È così, nipote amatissima. And here also the beloved is a clear reference to Toni Morrison's Beloved, because the novel opens on the word amatissima, which is the official translation of beloved in Italian. So there, again, there's a broader genealogy of female writing on sort of suffering and racial discrimination. E anch'io, in un certo senso, sono un archivio perché ricordo. So she posits herself as an archive because she remembers. Secondly, the archive is material because one of the central chapters, which I've highlighted here in the list of contents, as you can see, is referred to as an intermezzo decoloniale, which is quite unusual in this kind of bilingual juxtaposition of themed chapters. So so here we have this chapter is located in Rome's Museo delle Civiltà, which houses the former collection of the Museo Coloniale. Is currently undergoing a decolonization effort, and ironically, it's housed in the fascist architecture of the city's Eur district, which you can see here on the image, which was created by Mussolini. So in the structural economy of the novel, the thematic sequence of chapters is so to say, disrupted by what Scego refers to as the intermezzo decoloniale, and constitutes a heterotopic narrative and material space that forms a structural hiatus in the text. And I have here just quoted a very well-known Foucault passage from Foucault on heterotopia, so in which the real sites as a sort of alternative space in which the real sites of reference, so the spaces, people and objects subjected to colonial power, are simultaneously represented, contested, and inverted. And if we complement the Foucauldian heterotopia with post or decolonial studies, the archive is also often viewed as a third space that transcends racial, gendered, and class binaries, and from which a kind of new marginal spatiality emerges that becomes a space of resistance, a location for the production of counter-hegemonic discourse, to say it with bell hooks. And here we could also quote Achille Mbembe, who has thought about the power relations of the archive in the decolonial context. We have both these these two layers of spaces going on in Szego's archive. So in her narrative descent into the museum space, Scego takes us to the heart of the archive of atrocities, where every catalogued object has a certain narrative agency. So here the visit turns into an all-immersive sensory experience in which the author sort of almost senses, hears the march of the oppressors in the surrounding walls, and the colonial artifacts assume a voice that quite literally screams trauma. So I could give you lots of different passages here. So she said, "Il giro urla da ogni manufatto," so it screams from every single object. There's an abundant reference to forms of affective experience that bestow agency onto the objects in the museum. So here the giro screams, the casks suffocate. And there's also a very interesting warning and reference to George Floyd here, so to the present, the suffering of the material artifacts is, so here specifically she talks about these live casks, is linked to the current Black Lives Matter movement emerging from the last gasps of George Floyd. So there's this link. I won't go into it because I don't have much time. It's also the breath, and here moving on to bodies. So it's also the breath, or rather the lack of it, that emerges as one of the foremost embodied and frequently imagined symptoms of transgenerational trauma in Szego's novel. So which often coincides with a broader bodily paralysis. And in an act of what I would call empathic imagining, so building on Assmann's notion of empathic listening, Scego really imagines the grief her father experiences after his brother's death, for instance. She imagines his paralyzed jaw, his breathlessness, and she also imagines her grandfather, whom she never met, the colonized body. So her grandfather was actually the official translator of Rodolfo Graziani, one of the most infamous fascist generals in Somalia under Mussolini's regime. So she again imagines him sort of suffocating by speaking those English words, Italian words. And this obviously this imagining throws up a lot of ethical considerations, which Hani discusses so brilliantly in her book, and I think which also connects to the previous talk. So perhaps we can talk about that a bit later. But this is taken from an interview of Scego. So here she talks about the imagination. Filling in the gaps. I try to fill in the gaps, the unsaid, the removed, and the unexplored with my imagination. It is obvious that a professional historian does not perform such an act of using imagination, but thankfully in literature you can do it. You can fill the gap left unsaid by the history books. So post-colonial trauma has long been associated with forms of breathlessness as a somatic form of subordination, as well as with forms of bodily mutilation. And here, again, I won't go into it, but I could mention Fanon's work, references to amputation, excision, Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan novelist, referring to bodily dismemberment as a metaphor for memorial dislodgement of the colonial subject, for instance. So Scego builds on this long-standing genealogy of traumatized, suffocating, dismembered bodies, and and powerfully reimagines this transgenerational suffering of her family which is often sort of demonstrated in a seemingly endless proliferation of physical ailments, which really culminates in her own body. So here, just to give you an example, one example is her eating disorder, which she developed when her mother was trapped in the Somalian civil war in her teenage years, fails to return to Rome for a period of 2 years, and she's gripped by this force of the giro. And bulimia becomes a coping mechanism. And it's also translated into a figurative level, linking it to the conflict in the book. So I'm just going to read the first quote here: vomitavo lanciagranate, rivoltelle, mitragliatrici e ancora fucili di precisione, fucili a pompa, carabine, fucili anticarro, fucili d'assalto. So she's literally vomiting all these weapons. Another ailment that she suffers is blindness, the threat of blindness, because she's suffering from a glaucoma. And this obviously links also to the title of the novel, Cassandra, as a sort of visionary, whereas her body is really affected by this threat of a worsening eye condition, which is similarly ascribed to the inherited burden of her family history. Yes, you can see here, blindness for me is a concrete possibility. A giro turned into flesh, and so on. And I'm just going to very quickly move. So the trauma also translates into a collective level, but I'm just going to move to the images, which I just wanted to briefly talk about, which is another form into which she translates this traumatic experience. So trauma is often defined as an experience that cannot be registered by conventional spatiotemporal coordinates. And several trauma theorists argue that traumatic memory is non-verbal and non-narrative and registered in a specific imagistic way that stands outside normal memory creation. So trauma is often registered in terms of images. And Scego uses images quite a lot, photographs, images. And I just wanted to give one example here from the archive where she encounters a painting woman in a defensive pose. And here she's reminded of the so-called Kukure women of Mogadishu, who used to prostitute themselves to the Italians under the trusteeship to supplement their income. And this portrait then assumes the role of a narrative of the violence imparted on women under colonialism. So here, nella mia testa, il corpo di quella donna si sovrappone al dolore e all'umiliazione di 1000 altre donne che ho intravisto negli archivi, nei libri, nelle foto antiche trovate durante le mie immersioni nei mercantini delle pulci. At some point, her attention is caught by a small object which she sees in that image. And these reflections on female focalized trauma are suddenly interrupted by a flashback. So here she starts thinking about her mother combing her hair with that traditional handcrafted comb, bringing back memories of her stay in Somalia as a child, her mother as a young woman, and who combs her hair with a similar comb. And so it becomes a metonymic metaphor of loss. And here starts a reflection, a very interesting reflection on the links between storytelling and the archive. And so here she looks at the comb: guardare quel pettine potrebbe spingere qualcuno a ripristinare la comunicazione tra passato e presente, so re-establishing the communication between past and present, which is addressed to her niece. And then she talks about her writing. Anche questa lettera, iniziata 1000 volte stracciata, è memoria che si fa carne. So this embodied memory in her writing. And this again is a direct reference to Baldwin's letter again. So writing also, and this connects quite nicely to the previous paper, is also referred to as a cure here. So mi hanno spiegato che questo è un luogo in continua trasformazione, dinamico. Anche questa lettera è in perenne divenire, una base da cui partire per riflettere su di noi come famiglia, come diaspora, per curarci, so to cure ourselves, dal giro che ci va là dentro. Io curo te e con te, scrivendoti, curo me stessa. I cure you, and with you, by writing about you, I cure myself. So here again, an interesting form. And here she posits the museum as, and her letter as, a medicine. And I'd just like to finish by connecting that to the founder here of narrative medicine, who has thought quite a lot about storytelling as a kind of sort of curative form, and as also not only as a relational collective articulation of these blind spots of history, as we've seen in Scego, but also as a way of the telling of pain and suffering here becoming a way of enabling patients to give a voice to what they endure and to frame the illness so as to escape dominion by it. So here, confronted with all these disjointed memories, disintegrating bodies, dislocated spaces, the author narrator turns to storytelling, to a relational collective other, and also, as Arthur Frank has argued in the context of illness narratives, the way out of narrative wreckage is telling stories. And I'll end here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Katrin. Thank you for bringing in this wonderful paper. I was thinking about negritude and how negritude has been, according to a message and following a message, has been related to French life writing, but we have forgotten about other languages and how Italian, Spanish, too, in some ways, Portuguese have provide also narratives, self-narratives of the negritude, of the experience of negritude. So thank you very much. Thank you very much, because it was something that we didn't have.